speaker today is Dr. Blaney. Sure, most all of you know. I think he's going to talk to us about Easter in general. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Blaney.
Thought about the title maybe being What Easter Means to Me. This will be shorter than the usual message, and maybe when I'm done, some of you will be willing to share what Easter means to you as well. I want to give you a bit of personal history, but even before that, let me clear the air and let me know where I stand now. When it comes to there being a person named Jesus who died shortly after Passover, about 2,020 years ago, then became alive again a couple of days later, you can count me among the skeptics, the doubters. It's not that I think poorly of persons who believe, but I definitely do not think that their believing makes them more virtuous than I am. None of this is to say that Easter is unimportant. Back to my personal history. As I grew up, perhaps the most distinctive thing about Easter Sunday was that I got new clothes for it. At least a clip-on tie, maybe even a sports jacket. And the message of Christ's suffering, death, glorious resurrection was taken very seriously at the church that I attended, that my family attended. We sang, "Christ the Lord is risen today," with great gusto. Fast forward a few decades, Nancy and I lived in Coral Gables, Florida. We'd not gone to church for years, but our kids were preschoolers and we wanted for our family life to include a church. So we were very happy to find that the nearby congregational church was congenial. We were more or less active in that church for nearly 20 years until we moved here to Virginia in 2000. I looked forward to the Easter season mainly because the Sunday before Easter was usually given over at that church to a major musical presentation. The church had a well-funded music program, so it was quite exciting. For example, one of those major presentations, one in which I was a choir member, was of Ralph Vaughan Williams' 5 mystical songs, one of which has made its way into our hymnal, and we will sing the simplified version of that part of the Ralph Vaughan Williams massive choral piece today at the end of our service. And the first verse, I think, of it is especially important to pay attention to when we come to that. Our church belonged to the UCC denomination, the United Church of Christ. There's a lot of overlap between UCC and UUA, our denomination, more than you might imagine. Granted, when Easter arrives on the liturgical calendar, Bible passages describing the crucifixion are read in the UCC church, and indeed, Christ the Lord is risen today, is sung on Easter Sunday morning with great gusto, and without the uneasiness, the queasiness that we experience if somehow that hymn were to show up on our Easter Sunday program at this church. But in the unlikely possibility or event that you are a member of that church who wondered whether the person sitting next to you in the pew really literally believed any of the words in the hymn, you'd conclude they had no idea at all. But there was no discomfort about voicing the words. There was just also no pressure for you to believe them, no more than would be the case here. The ambivalence of that church, you might even call it hypocrisy if you wanted to be snarky about it, but the ambivalence of that church about the Easter story is probably common in a lot of mainline Protestant churches. There are, of course, denominations for which the literal death and resurrection of Christ is technically the reason for their very existence. Roman Catholic being the prime example. But even there, we know that a lot of worshipers are essentially going through the motions. The broader question is what to make of all of the miracles and supernatural explanations that are woven into the Christian tradition. As an aside, of the two major Christian holidays, Christmas is the one that's much easier to embrace. A cute little baby is born. What's not to celebrate? No more of a miracle than any other birth, at least if you skip the Immaculate Conception part. But Easter has a lot more baggage, involving, as it does, a return from the dead, which would, to be sure, count as a Class A miracle. And Easter is tied to the claim that Christ had died to atone for the sins of the world. What does that even mean? I, for one, find that claim more puzzling and troubling than comforting and reassuring. But anyway, back to that UCC church in Florida that we belong to. One thing that I became aware of was the pressure that the pastor felt when preaching the Easter sermon. For one thing, this was a rare occasion when the sanctuary was full enough to give the fire inspector nightmares. So it was an important moment for the pastor to make a good impression, to do something that might even cause some people to show up some other Sunday. But it was also a challenge because the big story of the day involved implausible events, miracles, supernatural explanations, and so on. And even if the pastors themselves fully embraced the traditional claims of Jesus' death and resurrection, in a UCC church, getting other people to share that belief is not your main goal. In fact, you'd likely scare some people away if you made too big an issue of it, and your major goal is not to scare people away. It could be awkward. Then you don't want people to walk out after the last hymn thinking, that sure was awkward. As I said, it was quite a challenge for the pastor preparing a sermon. So what's a poor pastor to do? Well, pastors of churches of all stripes usually nod to the reawakening of spring, the kind of thing that our flower communion is about. Safe territory for sure, as safe as celebrating the birth of a baby. Everybody loves spring almost as much as they love babies, even people who love autumn too. And even in a year like this one, when a few of the plants we've loved in past years drew their last breaths when the thermometer went below zero this December, even in such a year, we love the regrowth that does occur. So that's one starting point that these pastors could always go for and hold on to on an Easter sermon. But I can remember 3 sermons. I mean, I've heard a lot of sermons in my life, even if you only count the times that I've been organist or a choir member. I've heard a lot of sermons, but these are 3 sermons all on Easter Sunday that I can actually remember. Maybe 3 or 4 that I can remember in my life or something, right? And in these 3 sermons, these pastors, 3 different people, tried to go beyond that foliage-based narrative. They were given by 3 successive pastors at that UCC congregation in Coral Gables. Their names were Gary, Chuck, and Donnie. So one option a pastor has is to go full metaphorical. After all, it's the honest thing to do. If you really think that the crux of Christianity lies in Jesus' life and his teaching rather than his death and his miracles, then Easter is best thought of as a metaphor, a figure of speech, a rich myth. So, in one sermon I recall, dating to about 1994, no, actually exactly 1994, I've figured it out. The first of these preachers, Gary, his name was, basically riffed off of the word resurrection. He treated it as a glorious figure of speech. He recounted a number of not to be taken for granted positive events that had recently happened, and he declared them to be resurrections. I have a specific recollection of only one of Gary's resurrections. At the time, Gary was grieving the recent death of his wife's younger brother. who had been a documentary filmmaker and had indeed won an Oscar several years earlier. Just a few weeks prior to the Easter in question, that brother-in-law had been in the hospital with advanced AIDS, but he had been awake and aware, so it was a wonderful moment when just a few days before he died, he received a shout-out at that year's annual Oscar Awards program on TV. And so the dying man and untold millions of other TV listeners, watchers, participated in that shout-out. Well, that, of course, meant the world to the dying man and to his sister, who was our pastor's wife, and to our pastor, others who loved him. So, in our Pastor Gary's hands, during the Easter sermon, that event qualified as a modern resurrection. I'm fine with that. The second sermon that I remember dates to maybe 1998, and it was from Chuck, who was the interim pastor who followed Gary. He was one of the brightest people I've ever known. It's saying something when you teach at a major university, as I did at the time, and you get your weekly jolt of intellectual stimulation from the pulpit on Sunday morning. That's the way it was with Chuck. That year, his Easter sermon was basically a short story, a poetic recounting of a day in the life of a male aide from the Caribbean working for too little pay at a nursing home in Miami, fulfilling bedpan responsibilities, treating very helpless, very old residents with gentleness, care, good humor, humanity. And in fact, Chuck just shared some deeply emotional images, emotionally deep images, without insulting us by trying to relate it to Easter in any concrete way, other than the fact that it was Easter Sunday morning and he was talking about this kind of thing. If he had said, oh, see, this is all about Easter, it would have been to note that people who serve the needy can be found most anywhere, that suffering and regeneration are things that happen around us all the time, but he left it to us in the congregation to draw the links. It was a very powerful experience. I wish I had a copy of that sermon. The third one was in March of 2008. By that time, Nancy and I were, of course, living up here in Virginia, attending this church, but we'd driven to the Northeast for spring break. That trip had a very specific purpose. On the Friday before Easter that year, we went to see my terminally ill brother in Connecticut. We said our final goodbyes to him that Saturday, and though he did not actually die until the day after Easter, on Monday that weekend, we were grieving his loss when we woke up on Easter Sunday morning. We'd come to Manhattan on Saturday night, and it dawned on us that the third pastor on my list, Donna, would be preaching about a mile from where we happened to be staying in New York City. Donna had become the pastor of that Coral Gables church before we moved to Virginia, but had herself moved by 2008 to Manhattan, and she was the senior pastor of a venerable UCC church there. So at the spur of the moment, we grabbed a cab and arrived at the service late, but in time to hear the sermon. It meant a great deal to us in our grief, and I've often wished I could re-experience it. So you can imagine how happy I was when a few months ago I was going through a stack of old papers and I found a printed copy of that sermon that I did not know we had. That meant that I might have some say on the topic of the meaning of Easter today. And indeed, the rest of my message is pirated and adapted from the sermon we heard on Easter exactly 15 years ago. Donna began as follows, and I quote, she began with the story. After our all-church retreat last September, 3 of our members were in a terrible accident. They were Mary, Peggy, and Andy. All 3 were taken to different parts of the ER of the local hospital. When I got there, they were this is Donna speaking. When I got there, I discovered that they were all in pretty bad shape but alive. I was thrilled. As the night wore on, each one, hardly able to move their frame, wanted desperately to see each other. The ER staff had no intention of letting any of them move. Still, Andy and Peggy, who were in the best shape, insisted that they see Martha, who was in the worst shape. We conspired to sneak them through, and we found Martha lying in her bed in a somewhat drugged state. Andy and Peggy limped and stumbled secretly to her side. We had a resurrection experience. Our two stalwarts, wrapped in their hospital gowns, showing a little butt, grabbed a little comfort out of a lot of fear, which is the method of resurrection. In the method of resurrection, we understand that the big noise of big car crashes is not going to be the only sound in our ears. The scuffle of hospital slippers is also there. End quote. The next passage from her sermon is the one I have remembered most clearly through the years. Again, I quote. I'm just, of course, taking like 10% of what she said. This is what she said. Easter is an attempt to manage the end of life by telling the story of how some other people managed it. Mary is the practical one. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the practical one. Where is the body? She asked. Some of the disciples are the romantic ones, saying, we found ourselves strangely warmed, according to the account in the Gospel of Luke. Last but not least, Peter and Paul became the organizational geniuses. Let's create an institution to tell the story of the one who died, but remains in our hearts. Easter is a story about how to manage transition. Again, Donna speaking. Folk wisdom says that every end is really a beginning. This is what Christians mean by death and resurrection. Death is not a period but a comma. It is the movement from embodied life to disembodied life. When we acknowledge that loss, and that pathway of everyone's life, we are liberated from the fear of endings. We become people who know that everything must end, and that in that very end, there is a beginning. Death does not end life, nor is death to be feared. It is our destination as mortals. The Easter process drops the shield of bitterness, enters the suffering, and comes out joyous, because loss has been acknowledged. So you're probably getting some idea of why that sermon meant so much to me and Nancy in our grief that Sunday, Easter Sunday morning. Later in the sermon, Donna took exception to the idea that Easter is mainly about the arrival of spring. In her words, and I quote, lots of people get Easter wrong and think it's the time of fruit and flower. Instead, the point of Easter is the life after the flowering. It's the life after the death of the flower. It's the life of the Spirit, which takes over when the life of the body has died. It is when we really rejoice because death has stung us and lost its sting. We don't require flowers to prove beauty to us. We know beauty in a different way. We are lovers of all four seasons, even the fallow ones. And these are the words with which Donna ended her sermon, slightly edited by me. Life and life after death is an understanding of life linking to death, which then links back to life. It's like a swing, or even an old tire hanging from a tree. You get on it, you pump yourself up, and then you fall back down. When you make the reverse motion, the falling after the rising, sometimes you tuck your legs in under your knee. It makes the falling more fun. These swinging motions are the essence of life. First you get sick, then you get better. First you bleed, then you scab. First you are young, and then you are old. First you are full, and then you are empty. You empty to fill. You rise to fall. You can rise even further if you fall back further. You create energy for the swinging by the energy you give to both motions. Not just the rising, not just just the flowering, but the falling too. The life we have in our bodies is one kind of life, and the life we have after our bodies is another kind of life. We exist as memories, as testimonies, as hopes. It was a Protestant service, so the year ending words were, Jesus exists as memory, testimony, and hope. He is not dead, he is risen. So there you have it, folks. That's the end of her sermon, and you have just heard something very unusual for a sermon at this UUCH of the Highlands. That is a mention of Jesus, a somewhat reverential mention of Jesus from the pulpit. And you heard it from my lips, and I'm happy to be the person that you heard it from, because I think that Jesus was a pretty important person, certainly somebody to be remembered, though not because of the alleged miracles, or because of his alleged deity, or his death, or his resurrection. No, I think actually if you go to the Easter service, as it would be being read in many churches this morning, the mother of Jesus, Mary, had it right in what she said that morning when she first saw Jesus. She didn't call him Savior. She didn't say, "Holy shite, you've been resurrected." She didn't call him God incarnate. She didn't call him miracle worker. Anybody know what she called him? Anybody remember that from churches where that thing was read? What did she say to him? Rabbi, which means teacher. Happy Easter.